Your little hobby is embarrassing me, Sophia. The words cut through the morning silence like a blade through silk. Sophia Bennett's hands stilled on the clay sculpture she'd been working on since dawn, her fingers leaving gentle impressions in the soft earth that would never be completed. Behind her, Richard's voice carried the casual cruelty that had become his signature over the past 3 years of their marriage. She didn't turn around. Couldn't. Not when her eyes were already burning with tears she refused to let him see. Not when her heart was hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for flight. 500 people at the Patterson Gallery opening last night. Richard continued his expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood floor of their bedroom as he adjusted his tie in the mirror. 500 people who saw my wife playing in mud like a child, the sculpture before her, a delicate mandala pattern that spoke of wholeness, of sacred geometry, of the infinite possibility contained within a single circle, seemed to mock her now. Beautiful, meaningless, embarrassing. She had spent months preparing for that exhibition. Months of secret work in the small studio she rented across town, pouring her soul into clay and thread and hope. The reviews had been extraordinary. Dr. Reeves from the Art College had offered her a teaching position. A collector from New York had commissioned 3 pieces. None of that mattered to the man adjusting his $1,000 tie in their bedroom mirror. I got a call from Harrison this morning, Richard said, his voice growing sharper. Apparently his wife thinks you're some kind of undiscovered genius. She wants to feature your work in her charity auction. Sophia's breath caught. Margaret Harrison was the city's most influential philanthropist, a woman whose endorsement could transform a struggling artist into a celebrated one overnight. The possibility should have filled her with joy. Instead, she heard only the disdain in her husband's voice. I told him no, of course. Explained that you were taking a break from your little art phase to focus on more appropriate activities. He understood completely. The words hit her like physical blows. 3 years of dreams dismissed in a single phone call. 3 years of courage reduced to a phase he could end with his executive privilege. She finally turned to face him. This man who had once promised to love and cherish her, who now seemed to take pleasure in making her feel small. Richard, that opportunity could have what? He turned from the mirror, his eyes cold as winter morning. Made you famous, made you important, Sophia, you're already important. You're my wife, that should be enough. But it wasn't enough. Not when her soul felt like a bird beating against cage bars. Not when her hands ached to create beauty, and her heart yearned to contribute something meaningful to the world. The silence stretched between them, like a chasm that had been growing wider with each passing day. 3 years ago, when Richard Bennett had chosen her from all the women who circled his wealth, like moths around flame, she had thought she was the luckiest woman alive. A successful CEO who saw something special in the quiet art teacher from North Philadelphia. A man who promised to support her dreams while building their future together. Now she understood that he had never seen her dreams as worthy of support. He had seen her potential success as a threat to his control, her independence, as a challenge to his authority, her happiness as secondary to his reputation. I'm late for the board meeting, he said, checking his watch with the same casual indifference he might show a stranger. Try to find something productive to do today. The charity luncheon committee could use your help with decorations. Decorations. As if her years of artistic training, her natural talent, her growing recognition in the local art community could be reduced to arranging flowers for other people's causes. After he left, Sophia stood alone in their bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of his success and her surrender. The walk-in closet filled with clothes he had chosen. The jewelry box containing pieces he had bought her. Cold, expensive things that sparkled without warmth. The life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt like drowning from within. She looked down at her clay-stained hands, at the sculpture that would never be finished, at the dreams that withered a little more each day in the shadows of his disapproval. When had she become so small? When had she started asking permission to exist? The questions burned in her chest, like a fever demanding answers she wasn't sure she was brave enough to seek. 3 years earlier, the morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their bedroom, painting geometric patterns across Sophia's brown skin as she worked at her easel. Her fingers moved with quiet confidence across the canvas, adding delicate touches to the intricate mandala design that would become the centerpiece of her latest collection. "Chat, still playing with your little art project?" Richard's voice cut through the peaceful silence like a blade through silk. He stood in the doorway, already dressed in his $1,000 suit, his expression a mixture of amusement and irritation that had become his default whenever he looked at her work. Sophia's brush stilled. "It's not playing, Richard. It's my business plan. I've been working on this for months." He moved closer, his expensive cologne preceding him like a warning. When he looked at her canvas, she saw the barely concealed sneer that made her stomach clench. "Darling," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of patience one might use with a particularly slow child. "We've talked about this. You don't need to work. You're my wife." That's enough, but it wasn't enough. Not for her. Not when her soul felt like a caged bird beating against the bars of this beautiful, suffocating life. "I want to create something meaningful," she said softly, her voice barely rising above a whisper. "I want to contribute, to matter." Richard's laugh was sharp-cutting. "You matter to me. Isn't that enough?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Sophia turned back to her canvas, her vision blurring as tears she wouldn't let fall burned behind her eyes. She had tried to explain it before, the need to create, to build something with her own hands, to prove to herself and the world that she was more than just an accessory to his success. Her handmade jewelry line had started as a hobby, something to fill the long hours while Richard conquered corporate America. But it had grown into something more. Women had begun to notice her pieces at charity events. They asked where they could buy them. Compliments turned into commissions, commissions into a waiting list. "I have over 200 pre-orders," she said, her voice stronger now. "Mrs. Harrison from the country club alone wants 50 pieces for her daughter's wedding. That's real money, Richard. Real business. Real." He was behind her now, his reflection visible in the window. "Sophia, you're talking about selling trinkets to housewives with too much time and money. That's not a business. It's a hobby that got out of hand." The words hit her like physical blows, each one designed to diminish, to belittle, to make her dreams seem foolish and small. This was Richard's particular talent, the ability to take something precious and delicate and crush it with surgical precision. "My mother started with trinkets too," Sophia said quietly. "She built something beautiful from nothing." "Your mother died broke," Richard replied, his tone matter-of-fact clinical. "Is that what you want, to struggle and scrape and fail while everyone watches, to embarrass us both?" The cruelty of it stole her breath. Helen Bennett had died with little money but enormous dignity, surrounded by a community that loved her handmade quilts and pottery, that treasured the beauty she had brought into their world. She had died knowing she had mattered, knowing her hands had created something lasting. Richard continued, oblivious to the devastation his words had wrought. "I've worked too hard to build our reputation, to have it undermined by some vanity project. People will think I can't provide for my own wife. Or they might think you married a talented, independent woman," Sophia whispered. "They might think I married someone who doesn't know her place." The words hung in the air like a curse. Her place. As if she were an object to be positioned, a decoration, to be arranged according to his vision of how their life should look. Richard glanced at his Rolex, dismissing the conversation with the gesture. "I'm late for the Hartman meeting. We'll discuss this later," but they wouldn't. They never really discussed anything anymore. Richard would simply assume the matter was closed, that his word was law, that her dreams would wither and die in the darkness of his disapproval. After he left, Sophia stood alone in their bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of his success and her surrender. The walk-in closet filled with clothes he had chosen, conservative suits in navy and beige dresses that whispered rather than spoke, shoes that never made noise on marble floors. The jewelry box containing pieces he had bought her, cold, expensive things that sparkled without warmth, each one a small prison of expectation. She moved to her easel, her sanctuary in this museum of a life. Her paintbrushes lay scattered like abandoned dreams, some still holding traces of the colors she'd mixed in secret hope. The canvas before her told a story Richard would never understand. Layers of meaning built through patient, solitary hours when she felt most like herself. The mandala pattern was ancient, sacred, a symbol of wholeness of the universe contained within a circle. Her mother had taught her about mandalas during those precious afternoons in Helen's tiny studio, a converted garage in North Philadelphia, where clay dust danced in sunbeams and every surface was covered with works in progress. Art isn't about making something pretty, baby girl. Helen had said, her hands shaping clay with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was creating. Her fingers had been stained with earth and paint, beautiful in their imperfection. Art is about making your soul visible. It's about leaving something of yourself in the world that wasn't there before. Rich folks buy pretty things to fill empty spaces, but real art fills empty hearts. Sophia had been 12 then, awkward and uncertain, her hands clumsy with clay. But her mother had seen something in her, a spark that needed nurturing rather than containment. "You got the gift, Sophia. Don't let nobody convince you it ain't valuable just because they can't see its worth." Now, 15 years after Helen's death, with Richard's dismissive words still echoing in the room, Sophia understood what her mother had really been teaching her. Not just about art, but about dignity. About the courage to create even when the world tells you your creations don't matter. About the difference between being seen and being truly known. She thought of the women who stopped by her mother's studio. Neighbors, friends, strangers drawn by the beauty that spilled from the small space onto the sidewalk. They came for hope, for connection, for the simple miracle of watching something beautiful emerge from chaos. Helen never charged much, barely enough to cover supplies, but she had fed souls in ways that Richard's million-dollar deals never could. Her phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Patterson, the gallery owner downtown, who had been interested in her work. "Still want to discuss that exhibition? I have an opening in December." Sophia stared at the message, her heart hammering against her ribs. An exhibition. Her work displayed in a real gallery, viewed by real people who might understand what she was trying to say with her designs. It was everything she had dreamed of and everything Richard would forbid. Her fingers hovered over the phone keyboard. She could say no, could let this opportunity slip away like so many others. She could remain safely in her golden cage, surrounded by beautiful things that belonged to someone else. Or she could say yes. She could take this first small step toward becoming the woman her mother had raised her to be. The woman who mattered. Are you wondering what choice Sophia will make? Stay with us as this story of hidden strength and quiet rebellion unfolds. The gallery opening was supposed to be her secret triumph. For 3 months, Sophia had worked in shadows, creating her mandala collection in the small studio she had rented, with money carefully saved from her household allowance. She had told Richard she was taking art classes. Not entirely a lie, since she was teaching herself new techniques with each piece she completed. The Patterson Gallery buzzed with opening night energy. Women in elegant dresses moved between her pieces like butterflies drawn to flowers, their fingers trailing near the glass cases that protected her work. Sophia stood in the corner, wearing a simple black dress she had sewn herself. The first time in 3 years, she had worn something that truly felt like her own skin. "These are extraordinary," said Dr. Reeves, the dean of the local art college, studying the centerpiece mandala with the intensity of someone recognizing something unprecedented. "The cultural fusion is sophisticated but accessible. The use of traditional North African motifs to explore contemporary themes of identity and belonging. It's exactly what the art world needs right now." Before Sophia could respond, a familiar voice cut through the gallery's gentle hum like a blade through silk. "Well, well, look who decided to play artist after all." She turned to find Richard standing in the gallery entrance, his face a mask of controlled fury that made her blood freeze in her veins. He was still in his business suit, having come directly from the corporate dinner that had supposedly kept him occupied tonight. Behind him stood 3 of his business associates, Thomas Hartwell, Marcus Chen, and David Rodriguez, men whose approval he coveted more than his wife's happiness. The gallery fell silent, as if someone had pressed a mute button on the evening. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the soft jazz playing in the background seemed to quiet in deference to the storm approaching. "Richard," Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible. "How did you—" Jennifer Patterson mentioned it at the club this afternoon," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure every person in the gallery could hear clearly. "Imagine my surprise to learn that my wife has been sneaking around behind my back playing in mud and embarrassing us both in front of the entire city." The words hit her like physical blows, each one calibrated for maximum humiliation. She felt the familiar flutter of panic in her chest, the learned response of someone who had been systematically trained to fear his disapproval, to shrink at the first sign of his anger, to apologize for existing. But something was different tonight. Maybe it was the presence of her art surrounding her like armor. Maybe it was the memory of her mother's hands guiding hers through that first mandala pattern 20 years ago. Maybe it was simply that she had reached the end of her capacity for making herself small. "Ma, these pieces are remarkable," Mrs. Patterson interjected, stepping forward with the fierce protectiveness gallery owners reserve for their most promising artists. "Your wife is genuinely talented, Mr. Bennett. You should be proud." Richard's corporate smile never wavered, but Sophia saw the ice crystallizing behind his eyes. She had seen that look before, in board meetings when competitors challenged his authority, in charity events when other CEOs questioned his decisions. It was the look of a man preparing to destroy whatever threatened his control. "Oh, I'm sure they're very charming." He said the word charming, dripping with condescension. Sophia has always had a flair for crafts. Finger painting pottery classes, those little macrame plant holders she made in college. Very therapeutic, I'm sure. But I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. My wife won't be continuing with this particular hobby. Hobby. The word landed like a slap across not just her face, but across the faces of every person in that gallery who understood the difference between a hobby and a calling. Around her, months of work, weeks of preparation, hours of courage distilled into this single moment of public presentation, all reduced to a hobby by the man who was supposed to champion her dreams. "Actually," Sophia said, and her voice was soft, but carried the weight of 3 years of suppressed rebellion, "I will be continuing. I've received commission requests from collectors in 3 states. The Museum of Contemporary Arts in Pittsburgh wants to include 2 of my pieces in their upcoming exhibition on emerging artists." The silence that followed felt pregnant with possibility and danger. Richard's associates exchanged glances. Thomas looked uncomfortable. Marcus seemed intrigued, and David appeared to be reassessing everything he thought he knew about Richard Bennett's marriage. Richard moved closer to her, and she could smell his cologne mixed with something sharper, the scent of barely controlled rage. His voice dropped to a tone that was intimate and menacing. "We'll discuss this at home," but Dr. Reeves stepped forward, her academic authority cutting through the tension like a sword through fog. "Mrs. Bennett, I'd like to discuss a position at our college. Your work demonstrates a level of cultural understanding and technical skill that would be invaluable to our students. We're looking for someone to head our new multicultural arts program, a teaching position, at a real college, with real students who would look to her for guidance and inspiration. The kind of opportunity that could transform her secret passion into a legitimate career, her private dreams into public recognition." Sophia felt her heart expand with possibility, even as she saw Richard's expression darken to something approaching fury. "That's very generous," Richard said, his corporate smile stretched thin as wire. "But my wife's schedule is already quite full with her charitable obligations and social commitments. She serves on 4 different boards and chairs the annual Children's Hospital Gala. She doesn't have time for employment. Employment, not career, not calling, not opportunity. Employment, as if the work that fed her soul was nothing more than a paycheck, to be declined, a distraction from her real job of being his perfect accessory. John, the position comes with a sabbatical opportunity." Dr. Reeves continued speaking directly to Sophia, now ignoring Richard's attempt to answer for his wife. 6 months in Morocco, studying traditional textile arts and ceramic techniques with master artisans in Fez and Marrakesh. It's a chance to deepen your cultural connections and expand your artistic vocabulary. The program covers all expenses and provides a generous stipend. Morocco, the country where her mother had dreamed of traveling, where Helen had traced her fingers over pictures in art books and whispered stories about the colors that lived in North African clay. The opportunity felt like a message from her mother's spirit, a door opening just when she needed it most. "Absolutely not," Richard said, his mask finally slipping to reveal the naked anger beneath. "Sophia, we're leaving. Now." But Sophia didn't move. Couldn't move. Around her, the gallery full of strangers and acquaintances waited to see what she would choose. Her marriage or her dreams. Safety or possibility. The woman Richard wanted her to be, or the woman her mother had raised her to become. She looked at her mandala collection, each piece representing hours of solitary work, moments of pure creation when she had felt most like herself. The centerpiece, a large canvas where gold thread spiraled through deep blues and rich browns, seemed to pulse with its own inner light, reminding her of the woman who had created it in secret, in hope, in defiance of everything she had been told about her own limitations. "I need time to think," she said finally. Richard's face went white with rage, then flushed red with embarrassment. Around them, the city's cultural elite watched his careful facade crumble in real time. "There's nothing to think about. You're my wife. You have obligations, responsibilities. You can't just abandon everything because you've had some kind of artistic awakening." "I have dreams too," she said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff into open air. The words hung in the gallery like a declaration of independence. Around them, witnesses to a marriage dissolving in public held their collective breath, some fascinated, others horrified, all unable to look away from the moment when a carefully constructed life began to crack along its hidden fault lines. Richard's business associates shifted uncomfortably, clearly regretting their presence at what had become a very public marital meltdown. Thomas Hartwell, the most diplomatic of the three, placed a restraining hand on Richard's shoulder. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation elsewhere," he suggested quietly. But Richard shook him off his attention, focused entirely on his wife, with the laser intensity he usually reserved for hostile takeovers. "Dreams," he said, his voice sharp with derision and something that sounded almost like panic. "You want to throw away everything we've built for dreams, for finger painting and playing in clay like a child, for some fantasy about being an artist that will last exactly as long as it takes for you to realize you're not as talented as these people are telling you tonight." The casual cruelty of his words, the surgical precision with which he could take something sacred to her and make it sound ridiculous, hit her like a physical blow. But this time, instead of shrinking away, instead of apologizing for daring to want something beyond his approval, Sophia felt something hard and bright crystallize in her chest. Anger. Pure, clean anger at being diminished, at being treated like a possession, rather than a person, at having her mother's legacy dismissed as child's play. For 3 years, she had swallowed his condescension. Like bitter medicine, convinced herself that his disapproval was somehow her fault, that she simply wasn't explaining her dreams clearly enough. But standing here surrounded by her work, seeing the genuine appreciation in strangers' eyes, she finally understood that the problem had never been her inability to articulate her vision. The problem was his inability to see her as anything more than an extension of himself. "Oh, these aren't finger paintings," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word filling with the authority she had never allowed herself to claim. "This is my work, my art, my contribution to the world that doesn't depend on your approval or your money or your permission to exist." She gestured toward the mandala centerpiece, its intricate patterns catching the gallery lights like captured starlight. "This piece took me 4 months to complete. 4 months of research into traditional North African textile techniques. 4 months of experimenting with clay compositions to achieve the exact texture I needed. 4 months of threading gold wire through ceramic forms so delicate that breathing too hard could shatter them." Her voice carried across the silent gallery, reaching every corner, every witness to this moment of reckoning. "You call it finger painting because you've never bothered to learn what it actually requires. You dismiss it as therapy because the idea that I might have real talent, real vision, real worth independent of you is too threatening to your carefully constructed world." Richard's face had gone white, then flushed red with humiliation. Around them, the city's cultural elite watched his careful facade crumble in real time, some with fascination, others with second-hand embarrassment for the man who was being so thoroughly exposed. Thomas Hartwell, his business partner, stepped forward with diplomatic urgency. "Richard, perhaps, no." Sophia said, her attention still focused entirely on her husband. "Let him speak. Let him tell these people, these collectors, these curators, these artists, exactly what he thinks of my little hobby. Let him explain to Dr. Reeves why a woman with a master's degree in fine arts isn't qualified to teach. Let him tell Mrs. Patterson why my work isn't worthy of her gallery walls." The silence stretched like a held breath. Richard's associates exchanged increasingly uncomfortable glances, recognizing that they were witnessing something far more significant than a marital dispute. This was a public dismantling of the carefully curated image Richard had spent years constructing. The gallery erupted in murmurs, some shocked, some admiring, some delighted, to witness such unexpected drama among the wine and cheese. Mrs. Patterson stepped closer to Sophia, offering silent support. Dr. Reeves smiled slightly, recognizing the moment when potential transforms into courage. Richard's face cycled through emotions. Shock, rage, embarrassment, something that might have been genuine hurt, before settling into the cold mask that had become his default expression whenever she dared to assert her own will. "Fine," he said. finally his voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a sentence. Enjoy your little rebellion, but don't expect me to be waiting when you come to your senses and realize what you've thrown away. He turned and walked toward the gallery exit, his associates trailing behind him, like the remnants of his authority. At the door, he paused and looked back not at Sophia, but at the room full of people who had witnessed his loss of control. The Morocco opportunity expires in 2 weeks, Dr. Reeves said quietly to Sophia after the gallery door closed behind Richard and his entourage. But I have a feeling you've already made your decision. After Richard left, the gallery slowly returned to its opening night energy, but Sophia felt as if she were watching it all from a great distance, as if she had stepped outside her own body and was observing the aftermath of an earthquake. The woman who had walked into this space 3 hours ago, the woman who whispered her dreams and apologized for her ambitions, was gone, scattered like the fragments of a life that no longer fit. In her place stood someone new, someone who had chosen her art over her marriage's peace, her growth over her husband's comfort, her mother's legacy over her husband's demands. Someone who was finally ready to find out who she could become when no one was holding her back. The line has been drawn, and there's no going back. But what will Sophia's choice cost her, and is she strong enough to pay the price? The most dramatic moments of her journey are still ahead. 2 weeks later, Sophia stood in the empty house at 3 a.m., her suitcase packed and waiting by the front door. The Morocco program acceptance letter lay on the kitchen counter next to her resignation from the charity boards, her withdrawal from the country club, and the forwarding address for her mail. Richard hadn't spoken to her since the gallery opening. He conducted their separation with the same clinical efficiency he brought to corporate acquisitions, swift, thorough, and designed to minimize his losses. The house felt like a mausoleum filled with the ghosts of conversations they would never have and apologies that would never come. She had expected the silence. What she hadn't expected was the relief. Her phone buzzed. A text from her friend Maria, the only person who knew about her plans. Cars outside. You ready for this? Ready. Was anyone ever ready to abandon everything they had known for something they had only dreamed of, but ready wasn't the right question. The right question was whether she was brave enough to disappoint everyone except herself. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward the door, her footsteps echoing through the marble foyer. At the threshold, she paused and looked back one final time at the life she was leaving behind. The designer furniture Richard had chosen. The art collection that had never included a single piece she loved. The perfect kitchen where she had learned to cook meals for a man who was never home in time to eat them. The bedroom where they had slept side by side for 3 years while growing further apart with each passing night. Beautiful, all of it beautiful, and none of it hers. She closed the door quietly behind her and stepped into the darkness beyond. 6 months later, Marrakech, Morocco. The clay was warm between her fingers, responsive to her touch, in a way that felt like coming home. Around her, the pottery studio hummed with quiet concentration as she and 5 other international artists worked under the guidance of Master Youssef, whose hands had shaped clay for 60 years and whose eyes held the wisdom of generations. Kai Sitiktai, feel the clay's story, he said in his accented English, his voice soft, but carrying the authority of someone who had taught this lesson 1,000 times. Every piece of earth has memory. Your job is to listen and help it remember what it wants to become. Sophia closed her eyes and let her hands move without conscious direction, feeling the clay respond to pressure and movement, heat and moisture. In the 6 months since she had left Richard, and everything she had known, this was the first time she had felt truly still. Not empty. Still. Like a lake after a storm clear enough to reflect the sky. The woman who had fled Pennsylvania in the middle of the night, was disappearing day by day, replaced by someone who moved with confidence through the narrow streets of the Medina, who bargained for supplies in broken French and Arabic, who wore clay dust like jewelry, and felt beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with mirrors. Her phone, when she remembered to check it, contained messages she no longer felt compelled to answer immediately. Requests from gallery owners who had heard about her work. Invitations to exhibitions she was finally ready to accept. And increasingly desperate messages from Richard that progressed from anger to bargaining to something that almost sounded like regret. She ignored them all, not out of cruelty but out of necessity. This time, this precious, fragile time of becoming, was hers alone. "You're smiling," said Amara, the textile artist working at the loom beside her. "Good news from home." Sophia looked down at the piece taking shape in her hands. A bowl that seemed to emerge from the clay, as if it had always been there waiting for her to discover it. The form was simple, but somehow profound, its curves suggesting both strength and vulnerability, tradition and innovation. "No news from home," she said. "Just presence, I guess. Being here instead of there." Amara nodded knowingly. She was from Paris, had come to Morocco after her own life had fallen apart. A divorce, a career change, the kind of midlife upheaval that either destroys you or transforms you into someone you never imagined you could become. "Shaki, I arrived 6 months ago, convinced I was running away from my life." Amara said, her fingers never pausing in their work with the brilliant threads. "Took me 4 months to realize I was actually running toward it." That evening, Sophia sat on the rooftop terrace of her riad, watching the sun set over the Atlas Mountains, while working on a new design. The mandala pattern was evolving, incorporating elements she had learned from Master Youssef and the other artisans. Geometric patterns that spoke of infinite possibility, color combinations that sang with the warmth of North African earth. Her phone buzzed. Richard again. This time, instead of deleting the message unread, she opened it. "Sophia, I've been thinking about what you said at the gallery, about dreams. Maybe we could talk when you get back. I miss you. Miss you, not miss us, not miss our life together. Miss you." As if he were finally beginning to see her as separate from the role she had played in his carefully constructed world. She set the phone aside without responding and returned to her design. Tomorrow she would begin the final piece of her Morocco collection, a large mandala that would incorporate everything she had learned about herself in these months of solitude and creation. It would be her statement of independence, her declaration that she had found something worth more than security or approval. She had found herself. But even as she worked sketching by the light of Moroccan stars, she couldn't shake the feeling that the most challenging part of her journey was still ahead. Morocco had been her sanctuary, her laboratory for transformation. Soon she would have to return to the world that had tried to make her small and prove that the woman who had emerged from clay and possibility was strong enough to survive its attempts to diminish her once again. The test wouldn't be whether she could create beautiful things in a beautiful place, surrounded by people who understood the value of art. The test would be whether she could hold on to what she had discovered about herself when she returned to a world determined to convince her she was wrong about her own worth. Sophia has found her strength, but her greatest challenge awaits her return home. How will she navigate the world that tried to break her spirit? The answers will surprise you, and the resolution will leave you changed. The airplane wheels touched down at Philadelphia International Airport on a gray October morning, bringing Sophia back to a world that felt both familiar and foreign. 6 months in Morocco had changed more than her artistic technique. It had changed the way she moved through space, the confidence in her gesture, the steady way she met strangers' eyes without apologizing for her existence. Maria waited at baggage claim, barely recognizable behind designer sunglasses, and a new haircut that spoke of her own recent transformation. When they embraced, Sophia felt the fierce intensity of friends who had weathered parallel storms in different hemispheres. "You look—" Maria paused, studying Sophia's face with the attention of someone trying to identify a familiar song played in a different key. "You look like yourself. Like the woman I always suspected was hiding under all that perfection." Does that make sense? It did. Perfect sense. The woman who had fled this city in the darkness had been consumed with what she lacked. Richard's approval, society's acceptance, permission to be who she was meant to be. The woman who returned carried those things inside herself, independent of anyone else's blessing. "How much of the story do you want now, and how much over wine?" Sophia asked as they loaded her bags into Maria's car. "Give me the headlines now. Save the poetry for tonight." "And I'm not going back to him. I'm opening a studio, and I'm ready to find out who I become when I stop asking permission to exist." Maria's smile could have powered the city. "Good. Because Richard's been calling me every week asking when you're coming home. I ran out of polite ways to tell him that home might not be where he thinks it is anymore." The Philadelphia skyline rose before them, like a familiar challenge. Somewhere in that maze of glass and steel, Richard was conducting meetings and closing deals and building the empire that had once seemed like the center of the universe. But Sophia felt no magnetic pull toward that world, no nostalgic longing for the beautiful cage she had finally learned to escape. Instead, she felt the quiet excitement of someone standing at the beginning of an adventure, whose ending she couldn't predict, but whose journey she was finally ready to claim. Her new studio was in the Arts District downtown, a converted warehouse space with soaring ceilings and windows that captured light like prayers offered to creativity itself. The rent was manageable thanks to the commissions she had completed in Morocco, pieces that now hung in collections from Boston to Santa Fe, carrying her vision into homes where it was welcomed and valued. The space was nothing like the pristine luxury of Richard's house. The floors were stained concrete that bore the history of decades of industrial use. The walls were exposed brick that whispered stories of the immigrants who had once worked in this building. The heating system made interesting noises when the weather changed, and the freight elevator required a certain touch to operate properly. It was perfect. For 3 weeks, Sophia worked 18-hour days, transforming the raw space into something that could hold her expanded vision. She built display areas for her pieces, installed track lighting that would show her work to its best advantage, created a workspace where she could translate the techniques she had learned in Morocco into pieces that spoke to American hearts, while honoring North African traditions. The work was physical, exhausting, and deeply satisfying in a way that charity luncheons and country club meetings had never been. Each day she fell into bed, aching and covered in dust, and more alive than she had felt in years. Her hands, once soft and manicured for Richard's social requirements, grew strong and calloused from honest labor. She was installing the final lighting fixture when she heard familiar footsteps on the concrete floor behind her. The measured pace of expensive leather soles, the cadence of someone who had never doubted their right to enter any space they chose. "It's very industrial." Richard's voice carried the same carefully modulated tone he had once used to discuss her little art project. But something underneath it was different, uncertain, almost tentative. Sophia didn't turn around immediately. She finished adjusting the light fixture, testing the angle, until it cast the perfect glow on the wall where her Morocco collection would hang. The pieces were already creating buzz in the art world. Art International had featured her work in a 6-page spread, calling her an artist to watch, and praising her integration of traditional techniques with contemporary themes. Only when she was satisfied with the lighting did she step down from the ladder and face the man she had married 5 years ago in a ceremony that now felt like something that had happened to someone else. He looked older. Not just the passage of months, but the kind of aging that comes from stress and regret. The confidence that had once seemed unshakable had developed hairline cracks like marble under too much pressure. His suit was still impeccable, his hair still perfectly styled, but something in his posture suggested a man who was no longer certain of his place in the world. "Hello, Richard. You look well." He seemed surprised by this, as if he had expected her rebellion to leave visible scars, to diminish her somehow. "Different, but well. Strong. I am well." They stood in the empty gallery space, two people who had once shared a bed and a future now separated by more than physical distance. The silence stretched until Richard cleared his throat in the way he always had when preparing to deliver what he considered important news. "I came to ask you to come home." Home. The word sat between them like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread to the edges of everything they had once believed about their life together. "This is my home now," Sophia said simply. "When I mean our home, our life together. I've been thinking about what you said that night at the gallery, about dreams, about worth. Maybe I was too quick to dismiss Hachito, Richard." She stopped him with the gentleness she might use with a child who was finally ready to hear a difficult truth. "You weren't too quick. You were exactly who you are. And I was exactly who I was. Someone who kept asking you to validate what I should have validated in myself." He stared at her, as if she were speaking a language he almost, but not quite, understood. "I don't follow. I know, and that's okay." She walked to the window that faced the street, where late afternoon light painted everything gold. In a few hours, this neighborhood would come alive with people seeking art and music and poetry. People who understood that beauty wasn't just decoration, but necessity. Not just luxury, but sustenance for the human spirit. "I spent 3 years waiting for you to see me," she said, without turning around. "Waiting for you to value what I created, to support what I dreamed, to understand why art mattered to me. I was so focused on earning your approval that I forgot to approve of myself. And now you do." There was something almost wistful in his voice, as if he were recognizing something precious that he had lost without ever understanding its value. "Now I know that my worth isn't up for vote. Not yours, not society's, not anyone's. The work speaks for itself. The life I build speaks for itself. I speak for myself." Richard moved closer, and she could smell his cologne, the same expensive scent that had once made her feel protected, and now simply made her feel nostalgic for the woman she used to be, the woman who had needed protection from her own dreams. "What if I said I was wrong? What if I said I want to support this to support you? What if I said I've learned something about what I destroyed?" She turned to face him then and saw in his eyes something she had never seen before. Genuine regret mixed with a kind of bewildered loss, as if he were finally understanding that his dismissal of her dreams had cost him something precious, something irreplaceable. "Then I would say thank you. I would say I believe you've learned something important, and I would still choose this life over the one we had together." The words hung in the space between them, like a bridge that could be admired, but not crossed. Richard's face cycled through emotions. Hope, disappointment, something that might have been grief for the life they might have had if he had been different, if she had been stronger, if they had met each other as the people they were becoming instead of the people they had been. "I see," he said finally. "Then I suppose there's nothing left to say except, I'm proud of you. For the first time in our marriage, I'm genuinely proud of who you are and what you've accomplished." It was perhaps the most honest thing he had ever said to her, and the most heartbreaking because it came too late to save them, but not too late to matter. The truth has been spoken, but will it be enough to heal the wounds of the past? Sophia has found her strength, but the deepest healing is yet to come. The opening night of Sophia's solo exhibition arrived with the kind of crisp November air that made the city feel electric with possibility. Bridges Between Worlds. A Journey in Clay and Thread had sold out its preview reception, with collectors from as far as Chicago and San Francisco flying in to see what the art magazines were calling a revolutionary voice in contemporary craft. Sophia stood in her gallery, wearing a dress she had designed herself, deep burgundy silk that moved like water and made her skin glow with warm light. It was made from fabric she had brought back from the souks of Marrakesh, sewn in her studio during the quiet hours before dawn, when the city slept and her creativity flowed like prayer. Her Morocco collection anchored one wall, pieces that seemed to contain entire universes within their intricate patterns. But the newer works showed her evolution the way she had integrated North African techniques with themes that spoke to the American experience of displacement and belonging, of finding identity in the spaces between cultures. The centerpiece was her magnum opus, a mandala sculpture nearly 4 feet in diameter that seemed to pulse with its own inner rhythm. Made from clay she had carried back from Marrakesh, it incorporated materials from her Philadelphia neighborhood, fragments of glass from demolished row houses, threads from the textile mill that had employed her grandmother's generation, metalwork from the blacksmith, whose family had served this community for 4 generations. It was a piece about transformation, about finding beauty in brokenness, about the courage required to create something new from the fragments of what had come before. Every person who looked at it saw something different, their own story of rebuilding, of refusing to let destruction have the final word. "You outdid yourself," Maria said, appearing at her elbow with 2 glasses of champagne and a smile that could have lit the entire gallery. "Even Mrs. Patterson looks impressed, and you know how she feels about experimental installations." Sophia smiled, watching the gallery fill with an extraordinary diversity of people. There were the usual suspects from the art world, collectors and critics, gallery owners and professors, but also faces she had never expected to see. Her former housekeeper Rosa stood near the mandala sculpture, with tears in her eyes, whispering in Spanish to her teenage daughter about the beauty that could emerge from struggle. The girl nodded solemnly, her young face already showing the wisdom that comes from watching a parent work multiple jobs to build a better life. Near the textile pieces, Mrs. Chen from the corner grocery store where Sophia bought her morning coffee examined each work with the attention of someone who understood the patience required for such intricate detail. She had brought her grandmother, a tiny woman whose gnarled hands spoke of decades spent in textile work, and Sophia watched as the elderly woman traced the air above one of her woven pieces, recognizing techniques that had traveled across oceans and generations. A group of young artists from the community college clustered around her ceramic works, their faces bright with the recognition that someone who looked like them could create work that mattered. One young woman, barely 18, approached with the hesitant courage of someone stepping onto holy ground. "Excuse me, Ms. Bennett," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm studying ceramics at the community college. I wanted to thank you. When I saw your work in Art International, it was the first time I thought maybe someone like me could, make it." Sophia felt her heart expand. "What's your name?" "My Keisha Washington." "Muasha, what makes you think you're not like me?" The girl looked surprised by the question. "I mean, you went to fancy schools, you married rich. I'm from North Philly, just like you were, but I never thought—" "Keisha," Sophia interrupted gently. "I spent 3 years of my marriage being told my art didn't matter. 3 years believing that because I didn't fit someone else's idea of what an artist should be, I wasn't really an artist at all. You know what changed everything? I stopped waiting for permission to be who I already was. She gestured toward her mandala sculpture, its surface catching the gallery lights like captured stars. This piece, I made it from clay I carried back from Morocco mixed with earth from my mother's garden in North Philadelphia. It exists because I finally understood that my story, our story, is worth telling exactly as it is. This was what she had dreamed of without knowing she was dreaming it. Art that built bridges, that spoke across difference, that created community instead of exclusion. Art that reminded people that beauty and worth could emerge from any circumstance, any background, any dream brave enough to insist on its own existence. Nervous? Maria asked, though Sophia's demeanor suggested anything but anxiety. Excited, Sophia realized with surprise. I thought I'd be terrified, but I just feel ready. Like this is exactly where I'm supposed to be sharing what I've learned with people who are ready to hear it. Dr. Reeves approached her face bright, with the satisfaction of a professor watching a star student surpass every expectation. Sophia, I want you to meet David Chen. He curates contemporary ceramics for the Museum of Cultural Arts in New York. The evening blurred into a stream of handshakes and compliments, business cards exchanged like promises, invitations that would carry her work to audiences she had never imagined reaching. Each conversation built her confidence, not because people were telling her what she wanted to hear, but because she was finally sharing work that represented her authentic voice work, that had emerged from struggle and transformation rather than the desire to please. She was discussing her plans for a community workshop series, classes that would make art accessible to people who had been told it wasn't for them, when she noticed Richard standing near the entrance. He was alone, not accompanied by the business associates who usually orbited his social appearances, and he wore a simple navy suit that made him look younger, more approachable, less like the corporate warrior who had tried to clip her wings. "Excuse me," she said to the small group that had gathered around her and crossed the gallery with the confident stride she had learned in the Medina, where hesitation was interpreted as invitation for harassment. "I wasn't sure if I should come," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the commanding tone she remembered. "But I wanted to see what you built, what you became." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the crowd move through her work, like pilgrims in a sacred space. An elderly black woman paused in front of one of Sophia's smaller pieces, a bowl glazed in deep blues and browns that seemed to shift in the light. And she heard the woman explaining to her granddaughter how the piece made her think of her own grandmother's hands kneading bread, of the beauty that could emerge from the simplest acts of creation. "They understand it," Richard said, and there was wonder in his voice as if he were witnessing magic. "They see what you were trying to say, what I was too blind to see. Art is a conversation." Sophia said, her eyes following the granddaughter as she traced the air above the bowl, with her finger learning to see beauty in unexpected places. "I create one half of it, and everyone who looks at it completes the other half with their own experiences, their own memories, their own heart." I never understood that before. He paused, watching a young man in paint-stained clothes studying her mandala sculpture with the concentration of someone trying to decode a message meant specifically for him. "I thought art was just decoration, something pretty to fill empty wall space. A luxury for people with too much time and money." "It can be that too," Sophia said without judgment. "But it can also be medicine or prayer or rebellion or hope. It can be whatever people need it to be. That's the miracle of creation. It takes on a life beyond the creator's intention." Richard turned to look at her directly, and she saw that his eyes held a sadness she had never noticed before. Not just the sadness of loss, but the deeper sadness of someone who was finally understanding how much he had missed while refusing to see. "I owe you more than an apology," he said simply. "I owe you an acknowledgement of what I tried to take from you. Not just your art, but your right to define yourself. Your right to take up space in the world as yourself instead of as my reflection." The words settled between them like snow, unexpected, gentle, transformative. Sophia felt something tight in her chest finally release a knot of old hurt that she hadn't even realized she was still carrying. This wasn't the apology she had once craved, the one that would validate her pain and make him the villain of her story. This was something deeper: recognition, understanding, the acknowledgement of her full humanity. "Thank you," she said. "That means more than you know." Would it be presumptuous to ask, "Are you happy?" She looked around her gallery at the evidence of her courage made visible at the community of people who had gathered to celebrate not just art, but the human capacity for transformation. She thought of her studio upstairs where she worked until her hands were stained with clay, and her heart was full of purpose. She thought of the workshops she would teach the young artists, she would mentor the pieces she would create that hadn't even been imagined yet. She thought of the woman who had once stood in a bathroom mirror, asking her reflection for permission to exist, and the woman who stood here now, needing no one's permission for anything. "I'm more than happy," she said. "I'm alive. I'm contributing something meaningful to the world. I'm using my gifts instead of hiding them. I'm exactly who I was meant to become." Richard nodded, and for the first time since she had known him, his smile was entirely free of calculation or strategy. It was simply the smile of someone who was genuinely glad to see another person thriving, even if their thriving meant his loss. "Your mother would be proud," he said. The words caught her by surprise, bringing sudden tears to her eyes. Helen Bennett, who had died believing that her daughter would find a way to honor the creative fire that burned in their family's women, who had left behind letters encouraging Sophia to be brave, to create beauty, to trust her own hands and heart. "Yes," Sophia whispered. She would be. They stood together for a few more minutes, two people who had once tried to build a life together and had learned instead that sometimes love means having the courage to let someone go so they can become who they're meant to be. There was no bitterness between them now, no anger or resentment, only the peaceful acknowledgement that they had both grown beyond the people they had been when they met. When Richard left, Sophia felt a deep sense of completion. Not the completion of a love story returned to happiness, but the completion of a healing that had been years in the making. She had forgiven him not because he deserved it, but because carrying anger was too heavy for the life she wanted to build. And in forgiving him, she had finally forgiven herself for the years she had spent small, for the dreams she had deferred, for the woman she had pretended to be, in order to earn love she had deserved all along. The gallery continued to pulse with life around her, but Sophia stepped outside for a moment, needing air and space to process what had just occurred. The November night was clear and cold, the city lights creating their own constellation against the darkness. She thought of her mother, of the clay-stained hands that had first shown her how to shape beauty from earth. She thought of the women in Morocco who had welcomed her into their workshops, who had taught her that creation was both ancient and eternal. She thought of the young artists who had looked at her work tonight, with recognition and hope, seeing possibility in her courage. The circle was complete, but it was also just beginning. In the final moments of our story, the deepest truth emerges: healing isn't about returning to what was, but about becoming what's possible. As the gallery slowly emptied, and Maria helped her collect empty glasses and business cards, Sophia stood once more before her mandala sculpture. In the quiet light of the closing evening, it seemed to pulse with its own inner rhythm, a visual heartbeat that spoke of journeys undertaken and destinations reached. You know what the most beautiful thing about mandalas is? She said to Maria, who was counting the red dots that marked sold pieces. Besides the obvious answer that they're gorgeous and you're brilliant, Sophia laughed, but her voice grew serious. They're circular. No beginning, no end. Every point connects to every other point. The journey and the destination are the same thing. She thought of the woman who had fled Philadelphia in the darkness, terrified and broken, and convinced she was nothing without Richard's approval. She thought of the woman who had shaped clay in Marrakesh, slowly remembering her own hands' wisdom. She thought of the woman who stood here now, surrounded by the evidence of her courage made visible. All the same woman, all different women. All necessary parts of a pattern that was still being created, still discovering its own perfect shape. Outside the gallery windows, the city moved through its Friday night rhythms. Somewhere in those lit windows were other women sitting at kitchen tables, sketching dreams they were afraid to speak aloud. Somewhere were other marriages suffocating under the weight of expectations and assumptions. Somewhere were other hearts waiting for permission to beat with their own rhythm. The sculpture sold, Maria announced, consulting her list. To the museum curator. He wants to include it in their upcoming exhibition on contemporary women artists. Sophia smiled, but her attention was caught by something else. A young woman standing outside the gallery, her face pressed against the window, studying the mandala painting with the intensity of someone seeing something that spoke directly to her soul. She opened the door and stepped outside. We're closed, but you're welcome to come in and look around. The young woman, barely 20 with paint under her fingernails and hope in her eyes, shook her head shyly. I couldn't afford anything anyway. I'm a student. Your work is beautiful. It makes me feel like maybe what I'm trying to create matters too. What are you trying to create? Poetry. Visual poetry, I guess. Words and images together. Everyone says it's not practical, that I should focus on getting a real job, but it's what your soul needs to say. Yes. The word came out like a whisper, like a prayer. Sophia reached into her purse and pulled out one of her business cards, writing something on the back. Come to my workshop next month. First session is free for emerging artists. And remember, the world needs what you have to offer. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. The young woman took the card with hands that trembled slightly. Thank you. You don't know what this means. But Sophia did know. She knew exactly what it meant to have someone see your dream and call it valuable. She knew the power of permission granted and courage recognized. As she watched the young woman walk away, card clutched in her hand like a talisman, Sophia understood that this was why she had needed to find her own voice. Not just for herself, but for all the other women who were waiting in the darkness, wondering if they were brave enough to step into their own light. The circle was complete, but it was also just beginning. Her mother's voice whispered across the years. Art isn't about making something pretty, baby girl. Art is about making your soul visible. Mission accomplished. Sophia's story reminds us that sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to make ourselves smaller for someone else's comfort. Sometimes courage isn't a roar. It's the quiet voice that says, I matter, and lives like it's true.